have a couple quick announcements before we get started. Last night when we recognized those who had passed away, we also have Tim Golden, Deacon Tim Golden's wife passed away in October of last year, so we want to remember Tim's family in our prayers as well. The other thing is we mentioned the room number for the Wives Social, 162. That's on the other side of the campus. It's 1 and 2. 1 and 2. Also, for the Follies tonight, the lineup will be the Louisville group getting us started, followed by Gary Bach, Felix Garcia, Wayne Theineman, Alfred Mitchell, Syl Galvin. That's the acts we have so far. If anybody else wants to come, it's last call. Thank you.
Good afternoon again. Deacon Jerry Jorgensen is a consulting psychologist of the Metropolitan Tribunal and Assistant Director of the Office of the Permanent Diaconate in the Archdiocese of Dubuque, Iowa. Deacon Jorgensen is also a member, past chairman of the Marriage Research Committee, and senior consultant of the Canon Law Society of America. Deacon Jerry has his PhD from Colorado State University and his JCL from the Catholic University of America. So please give a warm welcome to Deacon Jerry Jorgensen.
Thank you, John. It's good to be with you here. This is my first opportunity to be at this gathering. I've planned to be here a couple other times in the past, and something always intervened, it seemed like. Life has a way of doing that, I guess. So it's great to be here, and I thank Deacon Paul for inviting me to be here with you. I thought it might, I don't know, you're probably better at this than I am, but often when I'm sitting out in a large crowd like this, attending a conference, and there's a speaker up there whom I really don't know, and there are a few people in here I know, but not too many of you, so it's good to be meeting new people all the time. But often as the speaker gets started, there are some questions going through my mind a little bit about who is this guy or this woman that's up there, and what about them? So I thought I might share with you a little personal information just to get all of that out of the way so we can get down to the real meat of things and really dig into it, right? Isn't that why we're here? And here's this challenge. I've had these great speakers before me with Bishop Cecchio last night and with Deacon Greg this morning and Father Brady, and it's after lunch. Is this a good time or not to speak? I don't know about this. There's a handout on your table, so I guess if you want to nod off, you'll at least have the PowerPoint slides before you to. But anyway, some personal information about myself. My wife's name is Mary. She is the person that has been trying to convince me and help me understand that character formation is a lifelong process, and that especially working on the virtue of humility is a lifelong process. She also helps with the honesty and with the spiritual journey part of that. And indeed, next month, we will celebrate 48 years of marriage. Thank you. And at this point, she still tells me she's in it for the long haul. We raise girls in our family. So we have 3 daughters, 8 grandchildren, 6 of whom are granddaughters, but the 2 youngest are grandsons. So the men are finally starting to make an appearance on the stage here. We're still way outnumbered, but we're keep on struggling there. I have had the good fortune, I guess that's one way to look at it, to be the church's authorized witness for the marriages of our 3 daughters. And so that's been an experience. And in fact, I ended up doing marriage preparation for 2 of the daughters. And I thought, when we talked about this, and I said, I'd be happy to arrange this marital preparation for you and make arrangements. They weren't all that well. One daughter was well connected with the parish, but the other weren't all that well connected with the parish at the time. But the parishes to which they were going, I did know some people, some deacons or some priests that I could connect them with. And they say, "No, Dad, we thought you would do it." And I said, "You're really serious about this? Let me talk to your fiance also." So anyway, I ended up doing it. It's too bad we didn't have Amoris Laetitia at that particular time, because I would have had them read chapters 4 and 5, as Bishop Cecchio talked about last evening. I think that's great pre-marriage preparation. Even throw in chapter 7 on parenting would be good. But we didn't have it at the time, so we made it through it, however. As a deacon, I'm a deacon for the Archdiocese of Dubuque, which is in Iowa. I'm born, raised, lived almost my entire life in Iowa. I guess I'm as Midwestern as you can get in that regard. In fact, I've lived in 2 of the 30 counties of northeast Iowa, which comprises the Archdiocese of Dubuque, for most of my life. So haven't moved around very much. I'm a product of 19 years of Catholic education and 4 years when I went to Colorado State. So I've had a little bit of the public education as well. And last Saturday, I celebrated my 38th ordination anniversary. So our kids, for better or for worse, have grown up not knowing what it means for their dad not to be a deacon. So that's been kind of an interesting process as well. Well, that's enough of the personal background anyway. Let's get down to what we're about this afternoon. I must admit, I did kind of a double take and question Deacon Paul when he called me and said, "We want like you to talk on the theology of marriage." And I said, "The theology of marriage?" I mean, not that I'm against the theology of marriage. I said, "I'm not a theologian." And he said, "Oh, we know that." I said, "Really? Why don't you get Deacon Bill Deitwig? He's the theologian here." "No, we want you to talk about the theology of family." So I said, "Okay, well, what you need to know again is that I'm not a theologian. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm a canonist." Okay? Now, when I started to study canon law, there were a few of my so-called friends, I guess, that told me that, do I really want to go away and study canon law? Because that's the dark side of the good news. Oh, really? And then there were some that said, that's the arterial sclerosis of the mystical body. Well, that hasn't been my experience, so I hope that after this afternoon that won't be your experience either. But what I'm going to be talking about is canon law in regard to the theology of family and the theology of marriage. Now, canon law can be described as the body of laws and regulations adopted by church authority for the governance of the Catholic Church. So we're going to somehow see how all of this has to do with theology of family and theology of marriage. So what are the goals that I'm going to try to accomplish this afternoon? Well, I'm going to try to look at the church's teaching about the sacrament of matrimony, but I'm going to look at it within how does the church talk about it legally or juridically? Because as a canonist, we're constantly complaining about theologians, and maybe biblical scholars too, as they go ahead and they talk about all these grand ideas and great things. And somehow we have to translate, what does that really mean practically? And what do we deal with on a day-by-day basis when we're talking about marriage and we're talking about family? So we have to somehow try to dig through all of that nice language. Now, Deacon Bill will probably say some things tomorrow that He has the counterpart to the canonist part. So we have to try to break through that language and somehow get it down to a more precise language that hopefully means something to most of us. Okay? So I'm going to try to do that with the sacrament of matrimony. And also I want to focus a little bit on matrimonial nullity and talk about that in light of Amoris Laetitia. The next thing I would like to do is present a view of accompaniment, that word that we have heard mentioned several times already, and a word that Pope Francis likes to use over and over again. And that'll bring in a little part of the psychological standpoint as well. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about imperfect situations and present a case study that we can try to talk about and see if that can help us understand some of this. So basically what I'm going to be focusing on when we talk about Amoris Laetitia, and I'll try to make a references here and there to that, are chapters 1 and 2 of Amoris Laetitia and chapters 6 and 8. So if you're thinking of the document and somehow trying to make, is there any connection to what he's talking about in the Pope's document? Well, look in those 4 chapters and hopefully you'll find some connection. Okay? And then you can challenge me at appropriate times here as we take some breaks, because I do welcome questions, and I will try to break. I better get my clock out here because sometimes I get talking and as my wife tells me, I don't know when to stop. So we'll try to follow this, and I'll try to keep track of the time here for us, and we'll take a break and allow some time for questions, and then we'll take a break, and then, lucky you, we come back and have a part 2 of this. So we'll see where it goes from here. So let's talk a little bit about marriage and what is marriage. Well, as Father pointed out to us in his talk, we can go back to Adam and Eve. And many of us do, especially Christians, and especially Catholics, as we talk about marriage. Of course, there is that whole other side that we're experiencing in our culture right now, which I would call the logical positivists or the legal positivists that say marriage is whatever we define it to be. Forget this Adam and Eve stuff. It's whatever we define it to be. Well, what I would like to do at this point, because Pope Francis in chapter 2 of Amoris Laetitia tries to look at the current reality of marriage as he sees it in the world. I'm not going to be quite that ambitious or speak in as good as a language as Pope Francis uses, but what I would like to do is take some time and whatever we're talking about or whatever we mean by marriage or however we define it, what is the state of marriage in the United States today? And Deacon Greg got into some of this morning. So just share some basic statistics. This is the psychology part of me coming out, and what's the empirical reality that we're dealing with here in the United States, and what are the implications for us of this empirical reality? Well, first, people are getting married later in life today. The median age for males is 29. Much different than when Mary and I were married. The median age for females is 27. We were 22. So it's changed considerably. And we were somewhat old at that time even. In a given year, nearly half of all marriages are remarriages for one or both parties in the United States. To me, that's a high percentage when we talk about nearly half of all marriages being remarriages. The marriage rate, which is, for me, that's the actual number of marriages per 1,000 unmarried adult women 15 years of age or older, continues to decline. It has dropped greater than 50% from 1970 to 2010. So right now, the marriage rate is 32.9 per 1,000 unmarried adult women 15 years of age or older, which is a considerable drop from going back even to 1970. The marriage rate for African Americans is considerably lower than for any other U.S. population group. And that's true for both men and women, but especially for African American women. The percentage of never married persons aged 25 to 35 has increased by 20% in the past 30 years, suggesting more lifelong singlehood. Relates to what Deacon Greg was talking about this morning in terms of this other aspect of family that we need to look at in terms of the dedicated single people in our midst, or at least if they aren't dedicated for whatever reason, they're single. 28% of married, self-identified Catholics have a non-Catholic spouse. And the percentage of interfaith marriage varies by region from less than 20% in areas with a high proportion of Catholics to about 40% in those areas that do not have a high proportion of Catholics. Why is that an interesting statistic? Because within the first few years of marriage, nearly half of all interchurch couples become same church because one spouse or both change religious affiliations. So interfaith marriage does have an impact. More than 80% of couples seeking to be married in the Catholic Church participate in a marriage preparation program. Now that sounds great, doesn't it? 80% of couples participating in a marriage preparation program. But listen to this other fact. In 1969, there were 426,000 Catholic Church weddings. In 2015, there were 146,000 Catholic Church weddings. And yet, in that same period of time, in the United States, the self-identified Catholic population has increased from 51 million to 74.2 million. So there aren't fewer weddings in the Catholic Church because there are fewer Catholics. In fact, there are many more Catholics. But for whatever reason, people are not getting married in the church. Again, I think that's a concern for us as Catholics and as pastoral ministers in terms of what do we need to do in terms of working with people to become married in the church. Roughly 63% of married men and 61% of married women rate their marriages as very happy. And this statistic has remained mostly steady from 1993 to 2010. So even though there's this majority of men and women that rate their marriages as very happy, we still have a relatively high divorce rate. I'm not sure what the disconnect is there, but I find that interesting. Speaking of divorce, there has been a modest decline in the divorce rate since it reached an all-time high in 1980. There are now 21 divorces per 1,000 married women 15 years of age and older. In 1980, there were 23, so it's a modest decline, but the rate today is still twice as high as it was in 1960. The projected rate of divorcing still stands at around 50%. When I say that, this means that the percentage of marriages first in remarriage entered into during a particular year that are projected to end in divorce or separation before one spouse dies is around 50%. For the average couple marrying for the first time, the lifetime probability of divorce is between 40 and 50%. Approximately 60 to 67% of second marriages end in divorce. And approximately 74% of third marriages end in divorce. So if people divorce and remarry, that doesn't necessarily mean they're getting it right the second time or the third time. Something is still happening there. About 1/3 of adults who have ever been married and are still living experience a divorce. For those of us who are baby boomers, this percentage rises to 46%. One's chance of divorce are diminished by such factors as older age. The older at which people marry, the less their chance of being divorced. The higher income that they have, the less the chance. The more education. These are things I think that we heard this morning from those of you making comments. Those who have a religious affiliation. Absence of divorce in the family of origin, and having a child after marriage. Not having a child before marriage, but having a child after marriage. The highest percentage of divorces occurs within the first 3 years of marriage. And one of the things that Pope Francis talks about in Amoris Laetitia is that we need to do more with marriage enrichment and ministering to people who are newly married. 85% of Catholics who have divorced do not seek a declaration of matrimonial nullity, which to me is just astounding. And I'm not quite sure what that means entirely. I can speculate about some things, but 85% of Catholics who have divorced do not seek a declaration of matrimonial nullity. At the same time, the U.S. nullity filings has dropped steadily from 1989 through 2015. In 1989 in the United States, in dioceses of the United States, 72,308 people filed a petition for nullity. 2015, 22,767, almost a drop of 50,000. So people aren't coming seeking degrees of nullity either. Cohabitation, that is, sexual partners sharing a household, has increased 1,100% in 40 years. Over 60% of first marriages are preceded by cohabitation, compared to virtually none 50 years ago. Dramatic change in what's happened in our society. And now greater than 40% of cohabiting households have children in them. So this is what's the reality in the United States today that we are facing with, to whom we are ministering. So how do we define marriage, or how do we try to define marriage from a legal standpoint? Well, most legal definitions talk about there being a legitimate union between husband and wife. So most laws, that's the definition they come up with. And that this legitimate union between husband and wife concerns certain concepts or ideas. One is conjugal rights, the right to sexual relations. And two, a common life, or the right to live together. But as we know, Catholics are subject to two law systems. They're subject to both the civil law and to the law of the church. And in fact, if you look at Canon 1071, paragraph 2, number 2, I know all of you that have that superimposed on your forehead there. That canon says that except in a case of necessity, no one is to assist without permission of the local ordinary at a marriage which cannot be recognized by civil law or celebrated in accordance with civil law. So in fact, those of us who do have the delegation to be the authorized witness for marriage are to make sure that whatever marriage we're witnessing is in accord with civil law. And if we don't do that, we have to get the permission of someone above us. The local ordinary, who is a territorial Episcopal vicar, or the diocesan bishop. So what does law do? Why do we even talk about law? Other than you're a canonist, and of course you just dream and think about that all the time, right? Well, law helps to provide good order. Law protects the rights of people. It protects the rights of married people. It protects the rights of clerics. It protects the rights of layperson. It protects the rights of those in consecrated life. There are laws addressing all of those, protecting the rights of those various groups. It protects the rights of all the baptized and the rights that all of the baptized have within the church. Laws remind us of our values. Hopefully any of the laws that we talk about are in agreement with our values and are explicit expression of our values. Laws help us to become what we are called to be. Now, when we're talking about church law, there are various sources of church law. Father Brady provided one source for us this morning in terms of Scripture. The other source of church law is tradition. What does our tradition teach us and tell us? And for the current law that exists, we look at the documents of the Second Vatican Council because they best express our current self-understanding of who we are as church and our understanding of marriage. And we look at certain when it comes to marriage and family, we look at certain post-conciliar documents. Now, prior to the Second Vatican Council, I would say the best place that you could find the church's teaching on marriage, so this is prior to Second Vatican Council, would have been in the encyclical of Pope Pius XI, Casti Connubii. I'm sure that's fresh in the minds of all of us, right? This was published by Pope Pius XI on December 31st, 1930. Casti Connubii was on Christian marriage. And it was really a response of the church to what had been going on in the Lambeth Conference. The Lambeth Conference is, I don't know if it's annual, it's maybe biannual, of the Anglican Church, in which they look at their laws, their doctrine, etc. And so Pope Pius XI's encyclical on Christian marriage was really in response to what had come out of the Lambeth Conference early in 1930. And Pope Pius XI addressed the sanctity of marriage. He re-emphasizes the church's opposition to eugenics because the Lambeth Conference that year, the Anglican Church was saying that there would be occasions when people should not have children. There would be occasions when there should be abortion because there was a chance of the child being born with serious genetic defects. So the whole idea of eugenics and mating to ensure better propagation of the species. And in Casti Connubii, Pope Pius XI reaffirmed the prohibition on abortion, and he talked about the prohibited using of any form of artificial birth control. Artificial birth control was opened up by the Lambeth Conference that particular year because of the influence of Margaret Sanger at the time. So that was the doctrine prior to the Second Vatican Council. Well, along comes the Second Vatican Council, and that is the theology that really is reflected in the current Code of Canon Law, the 1983 Code. So Pope John Paul II, who ended up promulgating the 1983 Code, had his canonists working on trying to take the documents of the Second Vatican Council and revise the 1917 Code so that this new code would reflect the Second Vatican Council. It was quite an undertaking, to say the least. So we won't go into all of that. The big document from the Second Vatican Council when we come to marriage and family was the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, which was promulgated on December 7th, 1965. And it really, there were approximately 19 paragraphs or so in that constitution that address marriage. And that really was what formed the basis then for what we see the law of the church on marriage. Pope Francis in chapter 1 of Amoris Laetitia tries to look at the tradition of the church and how we get to the laws we have today. So if you read chapter 1 in Amoris Laetitia, you get some of the history that Pope Francis is trying to bring together from scripture, tradition, and the Second Vatican Council. So what does Gaudium et Spes, what do they highlight about marriage? First of all, that marriage is a partnership of life and love, that it's rooted in the consent of the parties, that's established by God, that it's a lasting relationship, that it's ordained for procreation and education of children, that it's an intimate union of persons, so it's not only procreation and education of children, but there's also this personal intimacy, this intimate union. That it imposes total fidelity, and that it's unbreakable or permanent, and actually I think a better word than permanent in this case would be indissoluble. There's a different understanding that we have of indissoluble versus permanent. Almost anybody, if they're getting married today, will say they intend permanence. But typically, they do not mean they intend that the marriage will be indissoluble. They intend permanence, it seems to me, many people, not everybody, but many people, as long as everything works out, as long as it's fulfilling or it's satisfying. But once those things don't happen, then I am free to terminate it. I am free to dissolve it. So when we talk about indissolubility, we talk about this unbreakable bond. We talk about imaging what Father was talking about this morning in his talk in terms of the relationship between the church and Christ. What about the post-conciliar documents that become important? Well, at least in my estimation, the post-conciliar documents that are important are the encyclical Humanae Vitae that was promulgated by Blessed Pope Paul VI in 1968, Familiaris Consortio, the Apostolic Exhortation of St. John Paul II in 1981, and then the Apostolic Exhortation of Pope Francis in March of 2016. Familiaris Consortio, you recall, was on the role of the family in the modern world. But what St. Pope John Paul II did on that, he really focused on what he saw as the crisis of the family in the modern world. And he addressed it to bishops, clergy, and the faithful. Pope Francis in Amoris Laetitia talks about family, but he tries to focus on love in the family and tries to focus on the positive aspects, it seems to me. Not that he ignores what's in crisis, but he really tries to focus on the positive aspects of marriage. And what's interesting, what I find interesting, if you read about in the beginning of the document about who it's addressed to, one of the parties or groups that he explicitly mentions is Christian married couples. He explicitly addresses it to Christian married couples. Now, canonists, of course, when they see all of these documents, they like, which one is the real authoritative one? You know, which one do we really have to look at and the rest we can just ignore? At least some canonists do that. Generally speaking, encyclicals have a wider intended audience than apostolic exhortations. Generally speaking, encyclicals are addressed to all people of goodwill, whereas apostolic exhortations are generally addressed to Catholics. Also, encyclicals generally have a higher authority than apostolic exhortations. Still, all official papal documents carry various levels of Catholic teaching authority. from observations about cultural change to moral exhortation to expressions of long-standing Catholic doctrine, so on. And all Catholics, but especially clerics, are committed to approaching this whole body of work with respect and a desire to be better informed as disciples of Christ. And in fact, for those of you ordained after November 27th, 1983, those of us that were ordained before that, we didn't have to do this, but you others, you had to take an oath of fidelity and to make a profession of faith. And if you recall in that profession of faith, you start out in that profession of faith with basically the Nicene Creed. But at the end of that profession of faith, you say, with firm faith, I also believe everything contained in the Word of God, whether written or handed down in tradition, which the Church, either by a solemn judgment or by the ordinary and universal magisterium, sets forth to be believed as divinely revealed. I also firmly accept and hold each and everything definitively proposed by the Church regarding teaching on faith and morals. Moreover, I adhere with religious submission of will and intellect to the teachings which either the Roman Pontiff or the College of Bishops enunciate when they exercise their authentic magisterium, even if they do not intend to proclaim these teachings by a definitive act. What that's saying is that as clerics, we give a lot of weight to all three of these, whether it's an encyclical or an apostolic exhortation. And we took this oath saying that we understand that, and we are committing ourselves to that. When I'm in teaching the diaconate in the diaconate formation program, we, for the last however many years, do our ordinations in July. And so in January, I present these to those men that are going to be ordained in 7 months and say, you'd better read these over, and you better understand these, and if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them, because this is what you're going to have to do on your we do it on the canonical retreat, that they take this profession of faith and this oath of fidelity. So if you haven't thought about this beforehand, now is a good time to start thinking about it. So, from our standpoint, these do carry weight in terms of what the law of the church is. And certainly as a canonist and as a judge, when I'm called upon to interpret the law, because as a judge, that's what my role is, I have to interpret the law, and I have to apply the law to the specific situation or circumstance before me, whether that be a marriage nullity case, whether that be a clerical sexual abuse case, whether that be a property dispute between religious communities or between a diocese and a religious community. That's what I have to do, is somehow take this law and apply it, and it's these post-conciliar documents that help me in that process in terms of what does our law really mean, and what might it mean, or what does it mean in these specific circumstances that are before me now as a judge. So, what basically do Gaudium et Spes and these documents that I've just mentioned talk about? They say marriage is for a lifetime, that partners are to be faithful. They share an intimate relationship. And I think Pope Francis in Amoris Laetitia really tries to go into what is this intimate relationship that married couples share. He says, he talks about intimacy and passion being good in themselves and important in a marital relationship. And they are open to children. And Pope Francis adds, not only are they open to children, that marriage is fruitful in other ways. That marriage is fruitful in terms of social justice aspects. So he extends, I think, our understanding of marriage beyond just procreation and education of children in terms of being fruitful. I think since the last encyclical on marriage at Casti Connubii that I talked about in 1930 was issued, for me, anyway, it's safe to say that Amoris Laetitia should be regarded as the most up-to-date synthesis of authoritative Catholic teaching on marriage and family in the church today. That if we want to know what is the teaching on marriage and family in the church today, read Amoris Laetitia. Pope Francis tries to synthesize our current understanding and teaching. And to me, it seems to me it's the best source really to challenge all of us who are married to live up to the demands of marriage. And it also is a challenge for those of us that are pastoral ministers to be effective pastoral ministers. Now, Pope Francis acknowledges that there are social forces that make marriage difficult to sustain today. And Francis is quick to say, which I think is great, speaking as a psychologist, that married life is imperfect. No one married couple ever loves perfectly. That takes a lot of pressure off of me anyway, in terms of marriage. And what does Francis hold up as the perfect model of love? Trinitarian love. Well, I don't think any married couple, no matter how long they're together, 20 years, 25, 50, 65, or 70, is ever going to achieve Trinitarian love. So it's always a process. It's always developing. And he also says Christians should accompany people who experience brokenness or failure in marriage, and I'll be talking more about accompaniment later this afternoon. So prior to reading and interpreting the Code of Canon Law, we need to recall that there are various origins of law. There is divine law, which is not subject to change. And then there is human law, which is subject to change. So what is the definition that we use for marriage? The marriage covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of their whole life, and which of its own very nature is ordered to the well-being of the spouses and to the procreation and upbringing of children, has, between the baptized, been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament. Francis, it seems to me, in Amoris Laetitia, presents a new tone to our definition of marriage. And he emphasizes very much the positive aspects of marriage. He spends most of his time and energy in Amoris Laetitia talking about love, intimacy, and passion, and the importance of those. Now, Amoris Laetitia does not ignore rules and norms, but Francis says there's more to married life and to moral norms than just knowing the rules and norms. They're important, but that still leaves a lot to be said. The law talks about what are the essential properties of marriage. They are unity and indissolubility, which in a Christian marriage obtain a special firmness in virtue of the sacrament. And Francis, it seems to me, in Amoris Laetitia, really emphasizes sacramental marriage as the ideal. This is what Bishop Cecchio was talking about in his talk last evening. This is, I think, what Father Brady was talking about in his, what Deacon Greg was talking about in his, this sacramental marriage. Now, we also recognize what? That there are non-sacramental marriages in the church. So, and what do we say about non-sacramental marriages? They do not have this special firmness. They can be dissolved. They can be dissolved through the Pauline privilege, or they can be dissolved through the Petrine privilege. Those are not decrees of nullity. Those are actually dissolutions of marriage. So the sacramental marriage is the ideal. That's the one that's the unbreakable bond. Not that the non-sacramental marriages are not important or don't exist. We have a daughter that's in a non-sacramental marriage. But they do not have the same unbreakable bond that sacramental marriage has. They're not the ideal. The ideal that Francis holds up to us, and I think that our church tradition and Scripture holds up to us, is the sacramental marriage. And we say in the law that marriage enjoys the favor of the law. So when there is doubt, the validity of a marriage must be upheld until the contrary is proven. And that's what happens in the nullity process. The contrary has to be proven. The law presumes that people enter marriage in good faith. Canon 1057 states the three key juridic components of marriage. Marriage is brought into being by the lawfully manifested consent of persons who are legally capable. This consent cannot be supplied by any human power. So what are those three things that Canon 1057 is highlighting? Lawfully manifested. There is a form to the ceremony. That form is important. By persons who are capable of marriage. So we talk about impediments to marriage and being free of impediments. So for example, my daughter, who is in a non-sacramental marriage, had to get a dispensation in order to marry a non-baptized person. So a Catholic marrying a non-baptized person, non-baptism is an impediment to a Catholic entering marriage. Just as for those of us that are clerics and have spouses, or even if you don't have a spouse, if our spouse dies or we don't have a spouse, sacred orders is an impediment to marriage. So if we're in sacred orders, if you were in sacred orders and you want to get married, you have to get a dispensation for that to happen. That's not going to happen in the present time, in my humble opinion. But maybe in another lifetime. So there are other dispensations, impediments that also exist. And finally, the consent of the parties. What did people know and what did they choose? Now on September 8th, 2015, this was before the Ordinary Synod on the Family. In October of 2015, Pope Francis announced certain changes in the law, which created a little excitement among folks, and even among canonists. Once in a while, canonists do get excited. Not too often, well, unless they've had a couple of scotches, and then they might get a little excited. So he issued this motu proprio. That's basically when a pope decides to change laws on his own initiative. So a motu proprio really stands out in a canonist's mind when that comes out, because it means, whoa, there are some changes in law that are coming about here. I guess I'd better pay attention to this. So what's some backstory to this? Well, in August of 2014, which was before the Extraordinary Synod on the Family, which met in October of 2014, Pope Francis appointed a special commission that he charged to look at the law of the church, especially in regard to matrimonial nullity, and see if some changes need to be made or could be made to try to improve the process and facilitate the process for the people of God, so that the process would be easier for people and more understandable to people. And the recent Synod of Bishops on the Family discussed the Church's response to couples who are separated and divorced, and basically saw the changes in the law that Pope Francis promulgated before the Synod as being helpful in the process. So Midas Judex was promulgated and took before the Synod on the Family, so it was promulgated on September 8th of 2015 and took effect on December 8th of 2015. So it was promulgated before the Ordinary Synod, but didn't take effect until after the Ordinary Synod on the Family. Now, when we talk about divorce, divorce results from a decision of a secular court. A declaration of nullity, commonly called an annulment, is a declaration by a church tribunal or a church court that there was, in fact, an unbreakable bond was not established in this particular relationship. I think if we would change the name from nullity of marriage to something like a recognition of the state of freedom, that might help with this process. Somehow nullity rubs a lot of people the wrong way. They get and not only Catholics, but a lot of non-Catholics get very upset when they hear the word nullity. So if we could change the name somehow to some other name, I throw out this recognition of state of freedom, which is a little long, but probably wouldn't have quite the negative overtones that nullity has. And we could change the name without any substantive change to the law. We wouldn't have to make any changes to the law, but we could change the name to something else right now. Now, when we talk about nullity, and this is what people don't understand, the Church does not deny that there was a relationship between these two individuals. Does not mean that love didn't exist. Does not mean that no love had ever been there, at least for a while. That there had been no shared life hopes, no shared whatever. It's not that this relationship is being declared to be nothing at all, which is what people often understand it to be. That somehow this is nothing at all, and the kids are illegitimate, da-da. No. The Church doesn't deny any of that. But what the Church decides is that whatever was there, it's not what the Church defines as marriage. All of what existed before truly exists and will exist forever. What we're saying, or what the Church is saying, is that because of some identified reason, whatever was there had not generated the unbreakable bond of marriage, which, as things now turn out, is all to the good for the parties, in the sense that what? Neither party is now bound by this existential collapse of the marriage. Now, of course, not every case that's presented to a tribunal ends in an affirmative decision. There are some negative decisions. So this new legislation went into effect on December 8th, 2015. What Francis did was not change any of the teaching of the Church about marriage. All of that is there. What Francis did was change some of the human laws, the human origin of some things. And he introduced what I would call significant innovations in church procedural law by changing various canons in Book 7 of the Code. Book 7 of the Code is the Code on Procedures. It's all human law. So it's important to keep in mind that Pope Francis, with Amoris Laetitia, has not changed any essential document regarding the sacrament of marriage. He has made changes in human laws, laws of human origin, not laws of divine origin. And it's also important to remember that what he has done is to adapt, and I would say streamline, the judicial process by which one or both persons ask a tribunal to determine whether their marital union was in fact valid. Was this unbreakable bond established? That's essentially what is being asked. He provided a greater focus on the role of the diocesan bishop. The bishop, after all, is the chief shepherd and the chief judge. Every once in a while, when I run across the archbishop, I like to remind him that he's the chief judge and we could use a little more help up in the tribunal, so why doesn't he come up and spend a half a day or a day a week? After all, he is our chief judge. He looks at me, shakes his head, and walks the other direction. But this short process, maybe you've heard about this, is what Pope Francis did. One of the changes that he made says that in manifest cases of nullity, an abbreviated process may be utilized. What is this abbreviated process? Basically, some procedural laws can be admitted, but there must be strict criteria must be met in order for this to happen. Again, it's a change in human laws, not divine law. So what are the requirements for this abbreviated process? Both persons must agree to it. They don't have to agree to the nullity of the marriage, they have to agree to the use of the process. That's what they're agreeing to. The relevant information has to be readily available. And the information submitted has to clearly demonstrate that the marriage is null. Then it's the judicial vicar that decides whether or not these criteria are present to use the abbreviated process. The other changes that Pope Francis made had to do with rules of competence. Competence is what defines how I as a judge may assume or use my authority to judge over the nullity of the request, over the request of nullity. It talks about the power to judge or the power to adjudicate the decision. Same thing happens in the secular court. Does the judge have jurisdiction over this matter? That's what we use in secular language. In ecclesiastical law, we talk about competence. So he changed the rules on competence, again, human law. Made it easier for people to file petitions. And in fact, this change right here, the change in the rules of competence, I think will have greater impact on the nullity process than any of the other changes that Pope Francis instituted. Because it really did make it much easier for people to file with a tribunal that's close to them to adjudicate their case. The other thing, he's changed the requirement for a mandatory review of affirmative decisions. So there's no mandatory review, which can shorten the process by anywhere from 3 months to a year. But he reiterated the judge still has to reach moral certitude. In civil language, what would be equal to moral certitude, some canonists would argue that moral certitude is even stronger than this, but in civil language would be beyond a reasonable doubt. Some argue that moral certitude is even a higher standard than that. It's at least that right there. So he didn't change that. In fact, he reiterated that. He did say that the cost of the process should be as little as possible, even to none. So many dioceses no longer have a cost at all. In the Archdiocese of Dubuque, we still have a charge, $450. But the Archbishop decided that's nothing. And in fact, you can submit a petition, a request, and ask that that be waived or reduced. And we don't ask for an accountant. We don't even ask to see your tax return. Your pastor, your deacon, somebody has to support your request and say, yes, this is a legitimate request, and we'll reduce the fee or waive it entirely. I, as a judge, don't even know what people pay. I go ahead and work with the case not knowing, and I really don't want to know. It's not an issue for me. It's the issue for the director of the tribunal and the finance officer to worry about. So a marriage might be declared invalid because there's a lack of form, because there is the presence of an impediment, or because there's some defect in consent. Any of those reasons can lead to a marriage being declared null. And we're getting to a time to take a break here, so maybe this would be a good time to pause for some questions. I have some examples of nullity, but maybe this would be a good time to pause for questions and see if you have any questions at this point. Father.
How difficult for it is you to explain not to read the laws solely in an American context? For instance, Casper, in his famous intervention at the Synod, one of his test cases was precisely the idea of a person who, through good faith, has tried to solve the problem of their second marriage, but the infrastructure doesn't exist in an impoverished country, or there's nothing they can do to fix themselves. And we've adopted laws for a universal church, and it's not always written just for us.
Yes, I would say that the law does have to take and does try to take into consideration what are the circumstances, what is the cultural norm in this particular circumstance. When I am a judge, for example, many years ago, we were faced with a number of Vietnamese marriages that took place in Vietnam. So some took place here, and so I would appoint an assessor who had knowledge of the Vietnamese culture to help me try to understand the culture and what did marriage mean in that culture? What was that cultural experience of marriage? And so I think the law does allow for that, and for, again, considering the circumstances of the context. This abbreviated process that Francis put into place with Midas Judex, really, I think he was looking at what's happening in second and third world countries where tribunals do not exist, or they exist on paper only. And he was really saying the bishop needs to get involved. You know, here in the United States, every diocese has a tribunal. Now, some tribunals function better than others, and of course, Dubuque functions the best, right? In my opinion, and my opinion is always right. So, not that in many dioceses in the United States, the abbreviated process is being used. But I think it really is designed for places where tribunals do not exist. Back.
There have been a few cardinals who have asked the Pope for clarification on annulment.
Yes.
Well,
they haven't asked for clarification on annulment. They've asked for this clarification on married and divorced and receiving Holy Communion.
Isn't there cases in Germany, for example, people are getting married and not asking for annulment, and they're saying they're in a state of sin?
Well, yeah, we'll talk about that in the second half.
Okay.
Let me lay some groundwork for that, and
okay.
Deacon Bill can
And the
pick
reason
it
I'm
up
also
tomorrow
asking
morning.
it too is because a number of them, he refuses to give them a response, and basically they're concerned about that. So I would like you to make some comment about that also.
Well, Francis it seems to me, is very big, and I'll talk about this in the second session this afternoon, about saying that not everything is black and white, and all of the answers, he doesn't have all of the answers. And I don't know, I can't speak for Pope Francis. I'll let him speak for himself. But my sense is he figures he's answered the questions in terms of Amoris Laetitia and they can read the apostolic exhortation. And they're educated persons, and they should be able to read that. That's Pope Francis isn't telling me that. That's my opinion. But I'll talk more about that in the second session here and how that fits into the law.
I'd like to comment on two things you said early on. One about, Catholic weddings being down in the numbers of those weddings. I think with the increased popularity of destination weddings and outdoor weddings, the church has caused those numbers to be down. And my thought process is a priest can celebrate a mass virtually anywhere, whether it's on a beach, in someone's house, and yet we are limited to where we can celebrate the sacrament of matrimony. And the second thing is you talked about nullifications being down.
Filings for nullity being done, yes.
Okay. Why would someone want to go through the, I'm going to say hassle, but I'm going to put it in quotes, of a nullification unless you plan on remarrying in the church?
But to me, that's why you would go through the process, is that because of the way you value the sanctity of marriage and you see the importance of being married in the church, and therefore you would go through the process. Yeah, I guess hassle depends on what the experience is and how a particular tribunal functions or doesn't function. And then I'll,
Yeah, one more quick. Do you have any idea of the percentage of cases that come before tribunals? I'd be interested nationwide, you may only know yours, that are not actually granted nullification.
it's a very small percent. I can't give you the exact number.
It is a very
Even in our diocese, I can't give the exact number. We file a report every year with the Canon Law Society of America, and we file a report every year with the Apostolic Signatura. And so you can actually find, well, you aren't going to find, the Apostolic Signatura isn't going to give them to you, but you can buy a Canon Law Society of America publication, Proceedings, that has the data. So like in the proceedings for 2016 has the data for 2015 in it, for the, at least for those tribunals that are reported. And about 3/4 of the, I mean, it's like everything else when you're trying to collect data, many people don't respond. But I'd say about 3/4 of the tribunal respond. But it's a small percentage. Probably 20% or less are not granted. Now, part of that you have to take into consideration is often people don't file unless they have a legitimate chance of getting a decree of nullity. So that's part of it. And the other thing, sometimes people file and they don't finish the process. Well, those still get counted as not an affirmative not being granted. Okay,
Suggestion of using the term state of freedom, I think after working with RCIA and having been an auditor and in the tribunal stuff, maybe what we do is often they come when they want to get married rather than using the state of freedom of after the divorce or at a time like that, and ministering to those people where they would be in the state of freedom for wherever their life takes them. Most of the time, I do it is when people want to get married or when they're already married in some ways, and then find out that there's a marriage case like in RCIA.
right.
I think what the lady just mentioned is the opportunity is to stop teaching people that they need to think about nullity when they're coming to marriage, but rather start to talk to them about nullity as soon as we understand that they're divorced, that we should teach them that they want to consider going through the process
Although I'm very careful about saying that the process can be healing to people. And the reason I say that is because I can tell you some respondents do not experience the process as healing. And so
Jerry,
I'm very careful.
yeah. Can I respond to that because somebody else was talking about that? I'm an auditor. 3 cases I'm working on right now, they have filed because there is no intention of marriage at this point in their lives. They're not even considering it. They're not involved with anybody. They want the decree because it's going to bring closure to a very painful aspect of their life, and that's why they're going through the process. So it's not just because they have a marriage in the works. A lot of these people want to get, as one person said, I want to get right with the church again. So it's not always just about a marriage. And to the point about healing, one of those cases was just decided in favor, and when the gentleman came up to me to thank me, he talked about the fact that this has been a cathartic process for me.
And many people experience it that way. I'm just very
yeah.
careful in dealing with people because some people don't. And then over here. Oh, okay, over here. Here's the question over here.
I think it's really important that we let people know this change about the nod, that things do not have to be reviewed in the case of a approval.
Yes.
I worked with a couple recently, and so we had them go back to our diocese approved it. San Francisco said no. We went back, and then after Pope Francis made his declaration about this, we went back to our tribunal again and got them to approve the annulment at that point. And they had to, unfortunately, they had to refile and pay $700 again, but it was worth it to them.
Yeah. Boy, your tribunal is hardcore. In our case, if they refile again, we don't charge them. I guess we're too. Oh, his diocese also just went bankrupt. So yes, they are poor. Okay.
Is there a mechanism in place to track the fruit of these changes? Do they have you report back or anything about, because obviously these changes took place because we were trying to, free people up to come back to the faith or to be able to express the faith properly. Mm-hmm. Is there any mechanism set up to study that?
Well, no, there is no specific mechanism set up. The only mechanism that might speak to that is the number of nullity filings. For example, in our tribunal, and this is anecdotal, I've heard from other tribunals across the United States, nullity filings are up in 2016 and in 2017. It'll be interesting to see what happens like around 2020 once these changes have been in effect for a number of years to see if those filings still stay up or if we go back down. Mike, Deacon Mike?
The deacon over there made me think of this. This is not an annulment question.
Okay.
The canon law question, but marriage prep. I have a couple that came to me to get married. The history of the family is that an older sibling, they got married. They wanted to be married in the church, but they wanted to have an outdoor wedding. When they found out they couldn't, they just went ahead and they just sort of left the church and they're not practicing. This couple came, they wanted to start preparation, but they did not want to have the wedding in church. They wanted me to come and witness the wedding outside church in a park. And I said, we can't do that. I can't do it. It's against what the bishop says we can do. What their plan was and what they approached to me was that they were going to go ahead, have the outdoor wedding, and then return to me for Catholic marriage prep and can validate the marriage. What do we do?
Well, I think ultimately you do it. You probably don't encourage that particular path. But I think you do try to work with them and help them understand what is our teaching about why we want to be married in a sacred space, da-da, 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 da-da. And then if they go off, you still try to keep connected with them and hopefully bring them back. I mean, what you want to, I think what we want to try to avoid is that they somehow are flaunting the faith and they really aren't concerned about the faith, those kinds of things. I mean, I suppose if I want to be somewhat flippant, I can say, have them go to, it's Montana or Wyoming where the bishop has granted permission for outdoor weddings.
I've got,
Butte, Montana, is that where it is? So you can send them out there and they can have a deacon or a priest witness their marriage outside.
I've got a little bit of a different twist on that, and it's personal. My daughter wanted an outdoor wedding, could not get the dispensation. So after
Even,
her,
even a father as a deacon couldn't.
after her rehearsal, she and her wedding party came to the church and had a private nuptial Catholic wedding ceremony. All official by the law. They went through wedding prep, everything. And then the next day, they had their outdoor wedding for all of the guests. Perfectly legal, everything above board, everybody was happy.
Yes. I assume you didn't officiate at that, no. And there wasn't a priest or a deacon officiating at that, or there wasn't a minister, I hope it was a JP or a civil magistrate officiating at that. I mean, yeah, in many countries of the world, they have to have a civil ceremony before they can have the church ceremony, or if they have a church ceremony, they still have to have a civil. So Mexico, France are two of the ones that occur to me right away. There are probably other, I mean, I know there are other ones, but those are the two that are right off the top of my head. So, but generally speaking, we would want them to have the Catholic celebration of marriage first, or a civil celebration in countries where it's required first, and then come to the Catholic one. But yes.
In Mexico, that happened. You have to have your celebration by the civil. So Hispanic community sometimes get confusing.
Yes.
For us, the marriage is through the church, but sometimes they need to go first to the pope. They don't have an intention to get married outside.
Right.
But because we were educated like that, because the law and the church are separate in Mexico, so they need to go to the law. The sacramental marriage is no valid for the pope in Mexico.
Yes.
Yeah, so that happened in your case with some Hispanic kids. You try to understand that they don't try to avoid all these kind of structures, but it's how we were educated.
Yes, and you still encounter that here in the United States because they still have all of the Mexican culture and background with them, and they don't adjust. The same way whomever used it, canonically we don't talk about convalidation in these kind of contexts. We talk about the canonical celebration of marriage. Convalidation has a more precise definition than that, which we won't get into because you'd really fall asleep then. But I know what you're talking about, and yes. So let's take a break, and we'll come back at 3 o'clock, and we'll be really alive and invigorated. And